Reading for today is from the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verses 1 to 18. The covenant renewed at Shechem. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. When I brought your fathers out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the desert for a long time. I brought you to the land of Amorites, who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you, and you took possession of their land. And when Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. But he would not listen to Balaam. So he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. But I gave them into your hand. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you, as also the two Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from the vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the land, or gods of Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our fathers out of Egypt and from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God." This is the word of the Lord.
Well, I had this, I woke up thinking about what we might do with our Father's Day service, and I had this image of guys standing around talking to one another. And I think there's something about sometimes when guys stand around a barbecue, it's a little easier to talk, but I don't actually have a whole lot of barbecues for us to stand around. But I thought actually today it might be good for us to have a discussion time. And so after I just share some thoughts, we're going to get a tea and coffee, and I'm going to ask if the men can stand around and have a discussion, and there's 3 questions that I'll talk about. And then if the women will get around and talk, And the reason just for this separation today is I think there's a need to talk about fathering. And I realise some of the women, it might be hard for you to sit around talking about being a father. But I'm going to ask you at that point to talk about what it's like to be a parent, or if you're not a parent, what it's like to be a mentor, or if you're not a mentor, what it's like to be a leader. And then the final question for all of us to discuss is how do we support a new generation of fathers? Because there's something I think broken with fathering, and I think many of us who are fathers actually kind of focus a little bit more on what we didn't do right than what we did right. And if we look at the Old Testament, we often see leaders who are kind of portrayed in this fatherly figure. And yet if we study some of these fatherly figures in the Old Testament, we kind of also see that they didn't always get it right. So for the dads of us in the room who maybe feel like we didn't get our fathering right, it's okay. We're just human beings. And kind of the direction of at least the sermon today, we can have a discussion after this, but at least the direction of the sermon today is not looking at us as fathers, but looking at the faithfulness of God our Father. So the reading today, it begins with this story of Israel's history. It looks at, it's Joshua near the end of his life. By the end of chapter 24, Joshua dies. So this is kind of the end of his life. He's giving an encouragement to the generation that's in front of him before he passes on. You might remember that this is a very similar pattern because this is what Moses does before he passes on. And before him was Abraham. This passage sort of starts off with the idea that Abraham was the father of a generation. He was the father of a nation. And he kind of kicks off this generation that worships the true God. This passage tells us that the parents or the father of Abraham actually worshipped other gods. But we also know that generations after Abraham worshipped other gods as well. And so this story that we've heard here, and so well read by Jace Lee, she drew the short straw and got all the hard names to pronounce this morning, so well done on that, Jace Lee. But what we hear is that Abraham, who was considered a father of a nation, really was a leader, but he's portrayed in this fatherly figure. And then Moses, who leads the Israelites out of Egypt, he's kind of this leader figure, but he's also portrayed a little bit like a father of a nation as well. And at the end of his life, we read in the book of Deuteronomy that he encourages the children of the nation to follow the ways of God. Moses hands on the baton to Joshua, and last week we heard about Joshua would be at the tent of meeting with Moses. So in some ways, Moses has been mentoring Joshua a bit like a father who would pass on a family business, so to speak, to their son who they've mentored into it. Joshua is now the leader of a nation coming to the end of his time as a leader, and before he dies, he wants to lay a challenge to the people, remind them that they have a faithful father who is their God, and he wants to challenge them before he dies to make sure that they follow this God. So this passage is really pointing us to God. It's kind of interesting, I don't know whether you noticed it there, but it sort of says, Joshua says to all the people, but the narrative quickly turns to a narrative really from the perspective of God. It says, I gave you this, I gave you that, I gave you this. not Joshua giving that. Joshua wasn't even alive. It's actually God who is the Father who gives this great blessing to the people. And so it's interesting that even the narrative, it says, I brought you out of the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan, and they fought against you. That's a completely different generation. The generation that's hearing this from Joshua wasn't even around, and yet God is mentioning you. It's the idea of how God has been faithful for generation upon generation of their ancestors, and it's that faithfulness over generation after generation that means that this generation can put their faith and trust in God being faithful to them in the future. And so throughout the Old Testament, we read these accounts where some father figure or some leader of the people reminds them of how God has been faithful in the past and calls them to use that as trust for the future. In this occasion, we're hearing Joshua. And every generation seems to forget what God has done for the previous generation. And so, therefore, what happens is that each generation needs to be reminded of how God has looked after the people and then challenged to follow on from that. And so we've also taught through the book of Hebrews earlier this year, and that's a New Testament account of reminding the people that God has been faithful for generations and calling that generation, the New Testament generation, to follow God. I suppose that is the cycle of generations. That one generation assumes the faith and then the next generation forgets the faith. And so it's actually important for us not to just assume the faith, but to keep reminding a new generation of faith. It's interesting, someone said that there are no grandkids of Christianity, there are only children of Christianity. And what they mean is that if this generation doesn't pass on the faith to the next generation, then there is nobody to pass it on to the third generation. We actually need to be constantly working at passing the faith on to the next generation. So I suppose it's our time to be reminded of the faithfulness of God in our generation. You see, sometimes we can look around at the church and we can see that the church is supposedly in decline, at least if you think in terms of numbers, then church attendance is on the decline. But we can focus on what the church used to be, or we can focus on how God is moving in this generation, and we can be hopeful for a future move of God doing new things in a new season. Are we lamenting the past, or do we have a vision for the future? I suppose the same is true for fathers. Perhaps as we look at our journey as a father, we can lament all the things that we did wrong. Maybe we wish we could have fixed a few things in the way that we parented our children. Maybe we wish we had a do-over. We could focus on how we maybe didn't father in the way that we want to, or we could actually focus on how there's a generation that still needs our fatherly attention and that there's still more work to do. There's still a role for fathers to play in the lives of others. And I suppose if we feel that we didn't father in the way that we wanted to, maybe it's our turn to actually get around young fathers and support them. I don't know, maybe it's just me as a father, but maybe parents, you know it as well. When you were parenting, there seemed to be one or two ways to parent. Now it seems like there's 50 ways to parent, and whatever way you're doing is the wrong way. I think it's such a hard thing to be a parent in these days. And maybe if we feel we parented in ways that weren't what we wanted to, we need to get around the young parents. So the second thing that we learn from Joshua is that Joshua knows that he can't make the Israelites do anything. Parents, I suppose you particularly realise that you can't make your children do anything. Joshua knows that he has to leave the decision of committing to the Lord up to the individual households. If they don't choose it for themselves, then they won't follow through on their commitment. So it seems counterintuitive as a leader that you would paint this amazing picture of how God has been faithful, leading to the obvious answer that God has been faithful to previous generations, he's going to be faithful to us, so therefore commit to the Lord. But Joshua leaves the decision to them. But he offers us this example of leadership. Joshua shows his commitment as an example for others to follow. And Joshua says this line, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." It's a wonderful model of leadership, isn't it? It's like as a leader saying, own way forward, but as the leader, this is where I'm going to take us as a group. Are you with me? That's such a good model of leadership. Perhaps it's actually a good model of fatherhood. You can choose your own path, and I will support and encourage you as your father as you choose your own path. And I'll be here when you have the consequences of choosing your own path. But this is the way that I choose to live my life. And I recommend that you follow that. Actually, it's a good model for running a church. You can choose your own way of being a Christian, but this is the way that we choose to follow God as we come together as a church. It could be a good way to be a healthy Christian in a secular world. You can choose to be devoted to the things that you're devoted to, but I choose to be devoted to Jesus. I think Joshua points out something vital for us that we possibly don't understand in 2024. And that is that we all worship something. We just need to acknowledge what we worship. You see, when Joshua reminds the, when Joshua reminds the ancient Israelites, they all worship something. Notice it's just a choice of which set of gods you're going to worship. Are you going to worship the one true God, Yahweh, or are you going to worship the gods of the river? Remember what happened to the river? Yahweh actually split the river, saying that he was in control of the river so they could cross on dry ground. So right throughout this story narrative, God has shown that he's superior to any other false gods that the people have worshipped. But there's no sense at all that you worship God or you worship nothing at all. You're just worshipping someone, you've just got to acknowledge who you're going to worship. And Joshua says, if worshipping Yahweh is too hard, worship some of the other gods. Just admit who you're going to worship. So in the time of the Old Testament, even in the time of Jesus, right throughout the New Testament, there is an acknowledgement that there is a spiritual realm. If we look throughout all of human history, it's a very, very recent invention of Western secular to view that there is no spiritual realm. And in fact, one of the falsehoods of the secular narrative is that it's actually shifted, it's sort of denied the spiritual realm and said anything that's about spirit is actually a creation of human religious activity and it's not to be believed. So in our world today, people don't actively choose what to worship, But the reality is we all worship something. And here's a few examples of what dads could worship. We see it time and time again where dads worship the idea that their child will be the sporting hero that they never were. We also see dads who worship the idea that they work hard to provide for the family, and that also means that they get to check out of all the parenting responsibilities because they're working hard to provide for the family. We see in our world today parents who worship having children to the point where they actually provide so much for their children that they actually ignore their spouse. And you'll see these parents who've worshipped children that when their children leave, they actually don't know who their spouse is anymore because they've drifted so far apart. At the wedding of Jarv and Louina yesterday, I said to all the congregation that we as a group of people who support Louina and Jarv need to actually allow them to prioritise each other as a couple. And the irony is that a strong marriage actually makes a better friend to be with. So some people want to maintain a relationship with a parent, but we actually need to let them focus on their relationship in order they can be a stronger friend to have with us. You see, we all worship something. We just need to admit what we worship. And so Joshua, which is on the screen, says, if you decide that it's a bad thing to worship God, and this is from the Message translation. I like this translation because it kind of puts it onto the worship language rather than the service language, which kind of, in our world, could also mean that we're kind of obligated to serve the Lord. Whereas worship is kind of like a free will of the heart to do this. So if it's too hard to worship God, we could say this to our world today, then choose another God to serve and make sure you be open with what you do. Choose one of the gods in our world today. But as for me and my family, we're going to worship God. I think it's our time to commit to acknowledge that we're going to worship God, we're going to serve the Lord. After Joshua encourages the people with this, they respond that they will serve the Lord. Just like that generation, we too need to decide who we will worship. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." The reality is we have to decide daily who we're going to worship, who we're going to follow. This is a message not just for fathers, this is a message for everyone. Will you decide to follow, serve, and worship Jesus? And the great thing about Jesus is that when we realise that we've drifted from our commitment to follow him, through his grace and mercy, we can come back and recommit to serving the Lord.